Good morning once again. See everybody in Sunday school. All right, Mark chapter 11, verse 29. Mark chapter 11, verse 29. Lord willing, we'll start back there here in just a minute. Mark chapter 11, verse 29. But just to recap briefly, a few things we talked about last week, and then we'll get back into our lesson today here. Of course, we were in Mark chapter 11 last week, verse 25 and 26. And we wrapped up talking about how prayer involves forgiveness of others, as well as praying in God's will and abiding in Christ. It's not just a name it, claim it, as some people would have you to believe, Mark chapter 11, verse 24. But there's several things that goes in to prayer. One of those things is forgiveness of others. If we don't forgive others, God's not going to forgive us. I think the scriptures are clear with that. And then we jumped back to verse number 15 and started talking about how Jesus cleansed the temple. Verse 15 and 16, he cleansed the temple there. We know he kicked out the money changers and those that sold doves. And they were these people that were selling doves, they were probably preying on the poor, because we talked about how that these money changers, they changed the currency because people came in from all over to the temple to worship, and then they would actually probably buy their sacrifices there rather than bringing them with them on those long journeys. And we know doves, that was about the smallest thing you could get in the Old Testament as far as offering sacrifices. So that probably just made Jesus even more mad because they were preying on the poor by doing that. Verse number 17, we see where Jesus used Old Testament scriptures to justify his actions by kicking them out. Remember, he says, my house is supposed to be a house of prayer, and you guys have made it a den of thieves. In verse number 18, of course, this made the religious leaders even madder, so they wanted Jesus dead, but they feared the people, so they wouldn't do anything about it this particular time. Verse number 19, of course, at night, Jesus went probably back to Bethany. That was kind of what he was doing here. During the day, he would go to Jerusalem, go to the temple, and at night, he'd usually go back to Bethany, get some rest. And so that finished up Jesus cleansing the temple. And then we started looking at Jesus, the servant prophet. Remember, we looked at Jesus as the servant king, the servant judge, and then we started looking at Jesus, the servant prophet. In verse 27, back down to verse number 27. And of course, once back in Jerusalem, Jesus was confronted here by the chief priests, the scribes, and elders. In verse number 28, they proceeded to ask him a twofold question about authority. And this is one of four questions that are going to be posed to Jesus during our section here. A question about authority, and it was by what authority and by whose authority do you do these things? Do you have this doctrine? Do you perform these miracles that you've been doing? And we talked about, remember, it was their right as the religious leaders and their duty to question anybody that said they came in the name of the Lord. And that's based on the law in Deuteronomy chapter number 18, and we looked at that. But we also know that these particular people, they weren't looking for real truth. They were just trying to figure out a way to trap Jesus and actually to try to kill him, as we talked about in chapter 11, verse number 18. It says the scribes and the chief priests heard it and saw how they might destroy him. So again, they weren't looking for truth. They just wanted to trip Jesus up, try to find some way maybe that they could kill him. So that gets us down to, again, Mark chapter 11, verse number 29. Let me back up and reread, beginning in verse 27. I'll read Mark chapter 11, verses 27 through chapter 12, verse number 12, because this is all, again, part of this question of authority here that these chief priests, these scribes, and these elders had. So again, Mark 11, verse 27, and they come again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, there come to him the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, and said to him, by what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee this authority to do these things? And Jesus answered and said unto them, I will also ask of you one question, and answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or men? Answer me. And they reasoned with themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But if we shall say of men, they feared the people, for all men counted John that he was a prophet indeed. And they answered and said unto him, we cannot tell. And Jesus answering saith unto them, neither do I tell you by what authority I do these things. Chapter 12, verse 1, and he began to speak unto them by parables. A certain man planted a vineyard and set an hedge about it, and digged a place for the wine fat, and built a tower, and let it out to the husbandman, and went into a far country. And at the season he sent to the husbandman a servant, that he might receive from the husbandman the fruit of the vineyard. And they caught him, and beat him, and sent him away empty. And again he sent unto them another servant, and at him they cast stones, and wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully handled. And again he sent another. Him they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. Having yet therefore one son, his well-beloved, he sent him also last unto them, saying, They will reverence my son. But those husbandmen said among themselves, This is the heir, come, let us kill him, and the inheritance shall be ours. And they took him, and killed him, and cast him out of the vineyard. What shall therefore the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the husbandman, and will give the vineyard unto others. And have you not read this scripture? The stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they sought to lay hold on him, but they feared the people, for they knew that he had spoken the parable against them. And they left him and went their way. So again, back to this question here of authority that these scribes, these chief priests, and these elders posed to Jesus. By what authority do you do these things? And remember, it was their right to question these things, but we know they weren't doing it for the right motive. They weren't doing it to actually seek truth. So Jesus knew that. So that's why he countered with a question of his own, verses 29 and 30. And Jesus answered, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or men? Answer me. So Jesus here, he took them back. He knew their hypocrisy. And so he took them back to John because he knew they had already rejected John's teachings, right? They'd already had John killed, well, Herod did. And so they knew that they had already rejected John. And so they would reject Jesus too. Verse number 31, he says, And they reasoned with themselves, saying, If we shall say from heaven, he will say, Why then did you not believe me? So he knew if they answered that it was from John, Jesus is going to say, well, if John spoke the truth from the Lord, why did you not believe him? And then verse 32, here we see one reason they didn't say that, because the people, they revered John as a prophet. And they knew if they said he was not sent from God, then they might put some serious hurt on him there, because they said they feared the people. Verse 32, but if we say of men, they feared the people. For all men counted John that he was a prophet indeed. So Jesus kind of caught them here, right? They didn't know what to answer. On one hand, if they answered that John was a prophet, then Jesus is going to say, well, why didn't you believe him? If they said, well, John wasn't a prophet, then the people might do some damage to him. So they really didn't know what to say. So in verse 33, the first part, we see what they did. And they answered and said unto him, we cannot tell. So instead of answering what was true and what was right, their answer was what was safe at this particular time, because that was just the answer they knew they needed to give, so they wouldn't get hurt by the people, and then so Jesus wouldn't rebuke them even more. So there's really no answer at all. So it's just a typical approach that hypocrites and crowd pleasers have. They had it then, and they still have it today. Still going on today. A lot of people are just crowd pleasers, and they don't want to answer or tell people what's true and what's right. They just want to tell people what's safe. And we have that going on a lot today, and that's what these scribes and these elders and these chief priests did here. So because they couldn't give Jesus an answer, well, notice what he says, the last part of verse 33. He says, neither do I tell you by what authority I do these things. So Jesus said, you can't tell me, so I'm not going to tell you either. But just think about it, though. If these people had been paying attention, because again, we're within less than a week before Jesus' crucifixion. So he's been in his ministry for over 3 years now. So if they'd been paying attention, they knew he had mentioned multiple times in the past that his authority came from God, his Father. But they knew that already. They just didn't want to believe it. Just more tricks here that these religious leaders that they were playing. Now, and then in chapter 12, verse number 1, Jesus goes back to teaching in parables. Remember, chapter number 10 was paradoxes. We looked at 5 different ones, but now he goes back to teaching in parables, and he's addressing this parable to these religious leaders, and it's just a continuation here of this question of authority. And before they could get away, he began to speak in parables, it says in chapter 12, first part of verse number 1. And of course, that's the parable here, the vineyard and the husbandmen are tenants, if you will. That's what the husbandman was here in verses 1 through verses number 9. We see this parable. Let me reread verse number 1. And he began to speak unto them by parables. A certain man planted a vineyard and set an hedge about it, and digged a place for a wine vat, and built a tower, and let it out to husbandmen, and went to a far country. Now, this was a common practice for the owner of a property, a vineyard in this particular case, that he would let other people live on it in turn for them taking care of it. And that's always been a common practice throughout history that people do that. I know I've heard Dad talk about in the past how that's a lot of places they lived growing up. It was somebody else's farm, but they would take care of it in turn for being able to live there, things like that. So that's what was going on here. These husbandmen were actually probably tenants that lived there. So he let this vineyard out to these husbandmen, this owner did, so they could take care of it. And in verses 2 through 5, at various seasons here, the owner would send people to see what was going on. And of course, in this instance, they called them servants. He would send them to make sure that everything was going okay. Well, we know the story here. Every time he would send them, somebody to the husband, to the tenants, they would either beat them and send them away, or they would kill them. And this happened multiple times. Here we see this. And let me just read you a paragraph maybe to help better explain why at different times that he would send them back. It's because it says in the first part of verse number 2, and at the season he sent to the husbandman. It says the vineyard was a familiar image of Israel, and according to Leviticus chapter number 19, a farmer would not use the fruit until the 5th year, though we're not sure if the Jews were obeying this regulation at this particular time. But in order to retain his legal rights to the property, the owner had to receive produce from the tenants, even if it was only some of the fruits or vegetables that grew between the rows and trees or vines. This explains why the tenants refused to give him anything. They wanted to claim the vineyard for themselves. It also explains why the owner continued to send agents to them. It was purely a question of authority and ownership. So he needed to get fruit at different times, at different seasons, so he could maintain his ownership over this property. So that's why he would send these servants at different times of the year or different seasons to check and see how things were going on. So we know the story here. He sent servants multiple times. They killed them, they beat them, different things. But in verse number 6, we see, he says, having yet therefore one son, his well-beloved, he sent him also, last unto them, saying, they will reverence my son. So the owner here, he thought, I need to get things under control. I need to get control of this situation before my vineyard is taken away. He said, so I'll send my son. He says, surely they know that he's my son, so they'll recognize my son, and they'll stop these beatings and stop these killings. So we see what happens, verse number 7. But the husbandmen said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance shall be ours. But these husbandmen, these tenants, they thought otherwise. They thought this would be the perfect opportunity for us to get this property for our own. Because notice it says he's the heir, and if we'll kill him, the inheritance shall be ours, or this property, this vineyard shall be ours. So we see what happened though, verse number 8, they took him, killed him, and cast him out of the vineyard. So they proceeded to kill the only son here, just as they had the other servants, the other people that he had sent to check on the vineyard. They proceeded to kill the son here as well. So notice verse 9. Jesus asked a question. Remember, he taught this parable to them. He says about the husbandman here and the owner of this vineyard. But 9, he asked a question. He said, what shall therefore the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the husbandman and will give the vineyard unto others. Now, he posed this question again here to these chief priests, these scribes, and these elders. What will the owner do when he comes? When he comes back? What will the owner do? Now, Mark doesn't record their answer here, but Matthew does. In Matthew 21, verse 41, and they say unto him, talking to Jesus, he will miserably destroy those wicked men and will let out his vineyard unto other husbandmen, which shall render him the fruits of their seasons. So that was their answer. And you notice here the way Mark recorded it here. He didn't record their answer, but he recorded Jesus repeating their answer. He will come and destroy the husbandman and will give the vineyard unto others. So he repeats their answer kind of as a solemn warning, as like a judge would do. And so that's what Jesus did here in verse 9, number 9, and that was the answer. He says he's going to destroy these husbandmen and give the vineyard to others. So verse 10 and 11, Jesus went on to quote some Old Testament scriptures to them. Verse 10, and he says, have you not read the scripture, the stone which the builders rejected is become the head of the corner? This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So he quoted from the Messianic Psalm that they already knew in Psalm 118, verses 22 and 23. The stone which the builders refused has become the head of the corner. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So these religious leaders, they had rejected Jesus. They had rejected that stone. And that's what this parable was all about. Verse number 12, they knew exactly who Jesus was talking about, and they sought to lay hold on him, but feared the people, for they knew that he had spoken this parable against them. So again, they knew the Old Testament scriptures, so they knew that ultimately they didn't want to believe it, but they knew deep down in their heart that Jesus was that stone that the Old Testament was talking about. And we know this parable was talking about them. We know the vineyard, of course, is representing the nation of Israel. And then we know the husbandmen. Of course, that's these religious leaders that we're talking about, these chief priests, scribes, elders, Pharisees, Sadducees, the whole group of them. And of course, we know the servants were the Old Testament prophets that would constantly come back to the nation of Israel, trying to get them to turn to the Lord. And of course, the Son, we know that represents Jesus Christ. And so we know this parable was speaking to them, to the nation of Israel. And because of all that they had done, we know that the gospel was sent to the Gentiles, right? It was turned from the Jews and sent to the Gentiles. So we know it's all part of this parable. Now, had these people been following Jesus, these religious leaders, had the people not been following Jesus, these religious leaders here, they would have killed Jesus on the spot. Remember, it talked about here again how they feared the people. We already talked about that once, that they feared the people. So because of that, they wouldn't touch Jesus at this particular time. So they left him for now anyway, and it says they went on their way. They left him and went on their way. So that's a question here of authority that these Jewish leaders posed to Jesus, by his authority, why and how and who gave him his authority. Well, the next question we'll see is a question of responsibility. We see that in verses 13 through 17. This next question that another group is going to pose to Jesus. Let me read those verses 13 through 17. And they send unto him certain of the Pharisees and of the Herodians to catch him in his words. And when they were come, they said unto him, Master, we know that thou art true and carest for no man, for thou regardest not the person of men, but teacheth the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Shall we give or shall we not give? But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said unto them, Why tempt ye me? Bring me a penny that I may see it. And they brought it. And he saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? And they said unto him, Caesar's. And Jesus answering said unto them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marvel at him. So this next question of responsibility. Notice the first part of verse number 13. And they send unto him certain Pharisees and Herodians. We don't know who this they are. It's probably these chief priests, these scribes, the elders that were not able to trap Jesus by the question of authority. So they send another group. And again, they just did it to catch him in his words. The last part of verse number 13, to catch him at his words. But this group, the group that comes to Jesus this time, they're the Pharisees and they're Herodians here. It tells us in our verse here, verse number 13. Now again, they were just coming to try to trip Jesus up here, catch him in his words. Now remember, they had already teamed up once to try to get Jesus back in Mark chapter number 3. You remember when we studied about that, after Jesus had healed the man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. Mark chapter 3, verse number 6, the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how that they might destroy him. So they tried to team up once already. back early in Mark, chapter number 3. But now remember, these Pharisees and these Herodians, they were actually enemies. The Herodians, they supported Herod as well as the Roman government who gave them their authority. But the Pharisees considered Herod, remember, an evil ruler trying to take the throne of David. And they also opposed the taxes that the Romans were inflicting on them at this particular time. So they were enemies, but yet they had a common enemy that they were wanting to destroy. They joined together once again. We see that sometimes today. You got two different groups. They may not like each other, but if there's a common enemy, a greater enemy, then they'll join forces to try to attack them. It's the same way here with Jesus. So they teamed up again to try to get Jesus. Notice verse number 14, the first part of verse number 14. Now they were trying to butter up Jesus here by some of the things that they said. And when they were come, they said to him, Master, we know that thou art true, and carest for no man, for thou regardest not the person of men, but teacheth the way of God in truth. They said, we know you're true, and we know that you have no respecter of persons, and we know that you speak the truth from God. At least that's what they said verbally. Now, whether they really believed it in their heart or not, probably not, or they would have changed their ways. But they spoke that outwardly, probably trying to just impress Jesus by their words. But the last part of verse number 14 and the first part of that verse number 15, we see this question of responsibility. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Shall we give or shall we not give? So we know tribute just means to pay taxes. So their question was, should we, as Christians, or supposedly Christians, because remember they were the Pharisees and they were the Herodians, should we pay our taxes to the Roman government? Are we responsible as Christians to do that? Well, we see Jesus' response, the last part of verse number 15. He says, but he, knowing their hypocrisy, remember, he knew that they were just trying to trap him, because he says, why tempt ye me? So Jesus knew what was going on here. He says, give me a penny that I may see it. So he tells them to bring him a piece of their currency. That's all it was. And it was a penny, a denarius, I think is what it was called. And it's not a penny like we know today. It was worth probably about 14 or 15 cents. And it was also equivalent to 1 day's pay for a Roman soldier back in the day. Of course, we know, then the currency, the value is different than it is today. We understand all that. So he said, bring me a piece of your money so that I may see it. And they brought it to Jesus. Verse number 16, they brought it, and he said, whose is the image and the superscription? And they said, it's Caesar. So the image, of course, they just wanted to know, what picture was on it. And then a superscription, of course, that's just the writing. What writing did it say? And of course, it was Caesar's. It was Rome's. It was the Roman government's. That's whose it was. That's who had made it. It's similar to ours today, our currency we have today. Well, most of the world's currency, I guess, our penny's got Abraham Lincoln on it. The nickel is Thomas Jefferson. The dime, Franklin Roosevelt. The quarter, George Washington. And of course, those are the superscriptions, right? Those are the pictures. And then those are the images. And then the superscription, of course, we know our currency has in God we trust, and the United States of America, whether it be coins, whether it be paper money. And so it's probably similar to ours today. He said, bring it to me, let me see whose picture's on it, whose writing is on it, verse number 16. Well, verse number 17, Jesus gives them the answer. And Jesus answering said unto them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. And they marvel at him. So this word render here, in verse number 17, it means to pay a debt, or it means to pay back. That's what the word render here means. So he's saying you need to pay to the government what's theirs, and pay to God is what's his. That was Jesus' answer. Pretty simple, wasn't it? That's easy to understand. So I'm not really sure what answer that these Pharisees and these Herodians were expecting, but probably not this one, because it said they marveled at his answer. They may have been expecting Jesus to say, just forget the government, just ignore the government, don't do anything they ask you to do, because I'm here to take over. Of course, we know that didn't happen at this particular time. We know in the future that will happen, but it didn't happen here. And so he says just to pay your taxes. He tells the Pharisees and the Herodians here. It probably wasn't the answer they were looking for. And I realize this subject of paying taxes and tribute, that's the word that the Bible uses, and obeying the government's rules and laws and regulations. I know that can be a contentious subject. a lot of times. And, just me personally, of course, I pay my taxes, but I would have to group myself, I guess, into anti-government because they've just overstepped their bounds so much through the years. We all understand. We know that. No need to get into all that. But if they didn't abuse their power so much, it might not be that big a deal. Of course, we also know that the government doesn't make money, right? It's our money. It's my money. It's your money that they're spending. So no need to get into all that because the context here is just whether or not to pay taxes. That's the context here. And whether or not to obey the rules and regulations of the government, that's a different story. We won't take time to get in there because it would just make me mad, and I'd probably just make you mad too, probably some of the things we have to say. So you don't need to get so riled up about that. But I got to thinking when I was studying, though, and I get to the top of the list here, it's how fired up we get when we start talking about things like that, right? The government, the overstepping of the government, everything. If we could just get, again, I'm at the top of the list. If we could just get as fired up about trying to get the gospel out and trying to get our community in church as we get fired up about what the government's doing to us, I think we'd be a lot better off. Again, I'm at the top of the list because I get fired up talking about that. But anyway, all that being said, we do have to accept the fact, though, that God did set up human government for our good. It's supposed to be for our good. Now, I'm not going to take time to read these, but if you want to jot them down, read them later. I'm going to give you 3 different scriptures you can turn and read talking about how the human government was set up. Romans, chapter number 13. That's a real good chapter, Romans chapter 13. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 through 6. That's another good one. 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 6. And also 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. 1 Peter chapter 2, 13 through 17. Take time to read them maybe later this week if you're interested. And we know there are legitimate services that need to be paid for through taxation. We understand that. You've got your police, your fire, your national defense. Those would probably be the biggest ones. And then, of course, people. You have to pay people to oversee these things. We understand that, and that's how they get paid. And that's all part of it. And that's something that we have to do, and human government, again, was set up for our good to take care of that. And apparently that's exactly the way Jesus felt based on his answer here. He says, render or give to Caesar what's Caesar's, pay your taxes, pay your tribute, but give to God the things that are God's. So again, this question here, we have the question of responsibility. Is it our responsibility? The Pharisees and the Herodians came to him. Is it our responsibility to pay our taxes? And of course, Jesus' answer was yes, it is. It's our responsibility to do that. Same today. Even though sometimes we may not think it's exactly fair, according to Jesus, it's our duty, our responsibility to do that. So we had the question of authority. Now we've had the question of responsibility. The third question is posed by even another group. Now we've had 2 groups come already. Now we're going to see a third group comes, and that's a question about eternity. And we see that here in chapter 12, verses 18 through 27. Let me read you those verses. Then coming to him the Sadducees, which say there is no resurrection, and they ask him, saying, Master, Moses wrote unto us, if a man's brother die and leave his wife behind, and have no children, that his brother should take up his wife, and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were 7 brethren, and the first took a wife, and dying left no seed, and the second took her and died, neither left he any seed, and the third likewise. And the 7 had her, and left no seed. Last of all the woman died also. In the resurrection, therefore, when they shall rise, whose wife shall she be of them? For the 7 had her wife. And Jesus answering said unto them, Do you not therefore err, because you know not the Scriptures, neither the power of God? For when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven. And as touching the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, how in the bush God spake unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? He is not the God of the dead, but he is the God of the living. Ye therefore do greatly err. So we have a third question here, a question about eternity and what's going to happen in the resurrection. And this group, of course, is the Sadducees, verse number 18. Then came unto him the Sadducees, which say there's no resurrection. So these Sadducees, now you got to remember, They only accepted the law of Moses as their authority. And so if it was not in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament Moses wrote, they just typically would not accept it if you couldn't find it in the first 5 books Moses wrote. They did not believe in the soul. They did not believe in life after death. They did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe in the final judgment, nor did they believe in angels and demons. Acts 23, verse number 8, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. And so they didn't believe in the resurrection. A lot of these things they didn't believe in. And typically these Sadducees were usually wealthy, and they usually looked down on everybody else. So again, that's just a little history there about the Sadducees and who they were, because this is the group that came questioning Jesus about eternity. In verses 19 through 23, I'm not going to take time to reread that, but of course they brought this hypothetical question to Jesus about marriage in eternity. And that was based on Deuteronomy chapter number 25. Let me read you a couple verses. This is where they got this. If Deuteronomy 25 verse 5 and 6, if brethren dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in into her and take her to him to be his wife, and to perform the duty of the husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she bears shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. So we know the story here. There were 7 brothers. There was 1 wife. There was no children, no seed. So their question was, then in the resurrection, of which they really didn't believe, verse 23 it says, in the resurrection, therefore, whose wife shall she be? When they didn't even believe in the resurrection in the first place. So they posed this question, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Well, verse number 24, we see Jesus here. He revealed their ignorance in 2 different ways. In the power of God, as we'll see here in these verses, and also in the Scriptures that they supposedly had already knew for themselves. And they thought they had outsmarted Jesus, though, here. But we're going to see here that He reveals their ignorance, again, according to the Scriptures, and also according to the power of God. So we'll stop here. It's time to end Sunday school, and we'll start here again, Lord willing, and see what Jesus' response here is to them in verses 24, 25, 26, and 27, and see what Jesus has to say about eternity and about the resurrection and what's going to happen. And he kind of sets these Sadducees straight here with their questions. So again, Lord willing, we'll stop here, and we'll take up in chapter number 12, verse number 24, Lord willing, next week.